All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you can see me. Let's make sure we have everyone. Great, good. So good morning. Thank you again for joining us on day 2 of the MIT Energy Conference. My name is Nina Peluso. I'm a master's candidate in the Technology and Policy program here at MIT, and I'm the director for the Policy and Practice panel today. Today we have a fantastic group of people assembled to discuss energy policy in practice. Our speakers are on the front lines of shaping energy policy in the US from the state to the federal level. As the world looks ahead to a rapid energy transition, the pressure to provide innovative yet feasible policy solutions is rapidly increasing. I think we even saw that just now with John's keynote, where he said, you know, policy really is the key thing here. This panel, we hope, will address distinct obstacles that policymakers and key stakeholders face on both that grand scale, but also on the day-to-day operational scale. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Abigail Anthony, a Public Utilities Commissioner in Rhode Island, Christina Hajj, coming to us from DTE Energy, Laura Bartsch from Advanced Energy Economy, and our moderator, Erin, who's coming from Carbon 180. Thank you again for tuning in virtually, and thank you especially to our panelists for your flexibility as we've organized all of this. I've really appreciated it. I'm really looking forward to listening in. So without further ado, I'll hand it on over to Erin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nina. And again, really appreciate you having us on. So we're going to talk about policy in practice today. I have some questions to start us off, but want to encourage the audience to throw out questions. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. To kick us off, I just wanted to start to get an understanding from each of our panelists on how your organization or institution generally interacts with policymaking processes at the state, local, and federal level. I'll start with Laura, if that's easiest.
Sure. Hi. So Advanced Energy Economy is a national trade association, and we are focused specifically on transforming policy, and we look at it in terms of transforming policy to open market opportunities. So the bulk of our work actually does happen at the state level. We are working at the federal level as well, predominantly through agencies like FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We do also do some work up on Capitol Hill. At times there are more and less opportunities there. So we tend to sort of read at the moment with the COVID situation and stimulus packages, we are paying more attention and we are engaging more directly on Capitol Hill. At times we pull back from that. But I think Abigail is familiar with this, we do a lot of work on the regulatory side at the state level. So we work with commissioners, public utility commissions, and then we also do state legislative work. So I can dig into the details a bit more, but that's the overview.
Maybe Christina next.
Okay, hi. So I'm Christina. DTE Energy is a diversified energy company. I work on the utility side in the electric utility. And whenever you're in energy, whether it's on the non-utility or utility side, there's lots of layers to policy and regulation. And so, for us, we have lots of teams that interact with a lot of agencies and a lot of elected officials and policymakers and regulators. So, of course, we have teams that are on the compliance and filing side, but we have a regulatory team that works a lot with the state level regulators as well as the federal. We have a team that interacts with the regional transit operators, the RTOs or MISO. We have a state government affairs based in Lansing, one in DC, and then a local and a regional relations. So people who are based in the communities across our service territory who interact day to day at the local level. And, again, I can talk a lot more about that, but I'm sure we'll get into the details as we move.
Abigail.
Good morning. So I think a common misconception about utility regulators and public utilities commissions is that we create energy policy. When in fact, with maybe a few exceptions, because each state is a little bit different, but generally utility regulators, their primary role is to ensure that utility rates are just and reasonable, and that utility filings are justified. We generally don't play a role in creating energy policy, but we do ensure that utility rates and utility programs are consistent with public policy set by state legislatures. If we are going to make decisions that are sort of outside the norm of ensuring that utility rates are just and reasonable and balancing the interests of utilities and ratepayers, we need clear directives from our state legislatures. So for example, if we're going to take economic development or environmental priorities into our decision making, we generally need to receive that direction from a state legislature.
That's super helpful, and I really appreciate that example. And it would actually, I'd love to hear, you guys had kind of flagged that you'd be happy to share more details. Can you share a little bit about what your day-to-day policymaking looks like at your organization? And in particular, are there places, areas of influence? I feel like maybe a lot of our audience is kind of broadly familiar with the kinds of organizations and institutions you guys are coming from, but are there places or areas of influence that might kind of surprise the average layperson on kind of where you guys interact with policy?
I can jump in to start and then leave some space for others. I think, and this for me, I don't come from a policymaking background, so and I'm not even on our policy team, but I am directly involved in a lot of the planning and work that goes on. But I think Abigail touched upon this. I think the thing that most of us don't understand, and I certainly didn't understand before I worked at Advanced Energy Economy, is how policy happens, right? So you need a bill to pass. So Virginia is a great example. They have just passed a phenomenal Clean Energy Act that we, 2 years ago, didn't think was going to be possible in the state of Virginia. And now they've really leapfrogged a lot of other states with this incredibly comprehensive Clean Energy Act. But okay, so now the bill has been passed. So now it has to go into implementation, right? So that is where you then start to engage, where the commissions get involved. So for me, I think part of it is the life cycle of policy is very long. It takes a long time to get a bill passed. It then takes a long time to get the bill implemented. So when states are passing these goals, it's not instant. It isn't a light switch, right? There's a long process that goes involved, and you need to be paying attention. An organization like ours needs to be paying attention to represent our companies the whole way through that process, because there are multiple touch points at different phases in implementation. And if you, frankly, take your eye off the prize in one of those phases, it can be really detrimental to the policy. So it's tracking, coordinating, and continually building the relationships along the whole way in the life cycle of, from inception of idea through bill into actual implementation.
What about others? Abigail or Christina?
Abigail, you can go ahead.
Sure. I think just building on Laura's remarks, one thing that I would note that that I've been thinking a lot about lately is just how often I'll say sort of we, as in the general we, that maybe more specifically like the climate advocacy community or clean energy community has achieved public policy goals through programs and rates that are implemented on the utility bill instead of through our tax code. And that has a lot of implications that we may not, that I think that are generally often frustrating to utility regulators, in that I've been thinking a lot about how to deal with the sort of the consequences of those. We've succeeded in advancing sort of progressive climate policy in many places on the utility bill through clean energy programs and energy efficiency programs. And often those are environmental policies that go beyond just the internalizing of externalities. But we haven't made the utility bill itself progressive. So while we're trying to achieve these progressive goals, the utility bill is a very regressive tool for implementing policy. And the outcome of that is that often the most vulnerable, the most energy burdened customers are now also carrying the heaviest burden of paying for the cost of climate change, or paying for, to clean up climate change. And ultimately, I'm afraid that may be a big problem. In that if we are going to advance our progressive public policies through the utility bill instead of the tax code, maybe we should also be taking a hard look at making the utility bill progressive, making it look a little bit more like the way we implement taxes.
So, I was smiling as you guys were talking because I agree with what you were saying. And so for me, when I tell people generally, when they ask me what I do and I say I work in energy policy, the response is, oh, cool, like renewables. And so when I explain a little bit more of the scope of, renewables is a really important part of that, but there's a lot that goes into it. People either lose interest or their eyes glaze over a little bit, or they ask a lot of questions and never thought about energy beyond, switching their lights on when they have an outage or when they're paying their bill. And so, I think that that's a really good opportunity to engage with people. And I think that, Laura, you were talking about the policy process. And I would say the process, whether it's a near-term or a long-term project or goal we're trying to achieve, the process is the same, right? So there's an education component, there's the concept development, then there's a policy analysis and development piece, there's the negotiation process and the passage, and then implementation, which could take years, right? Michigan passed a comprehensive energy law in 2016, and we're still not through completely the full implementation of that. And then you get into reviewing, right? Where are the gaps in the policy? What further direction does the regulatory body need? What unintended consequences are there? And then you kind of go back through the cycle. And, day to day, I'm balancing those, how we're working towards those long-term goals of, a net zero utility, but then also a net zero economy. And then also the day-to-day of, the customer experience and what's happening with the regulations and let's say over the last 12 months, how many outages have you had and what kind of bill credit does that trigger, right? So those near-term things that are happening in the moment for our customer and how they interact with us through the grid versus that long-term commitment and moving, towards our goals. And so I think the balance of the day-to-day is it's exciting. There's some mental acrobats that have to happen as you jump between one subject and the other. But I think it's exciting and there's a lot to do.
Absolutely. And I think, when you guys are talking about the different touch points and different, groups that are involved in this, I'm really curious to hear, in all of those forums, you're talking about, different places at the local, state, and federal level, things from FERC to utility commissions to, consumers. Which stakeholders for you guys are the most powerful in the forums that you guys work in? And then Christina, on your point, how do you think about balancing that kind of short-term reactionary need to the long-term goals, like you had mentioned, that kind of day-to-day questions on have you experienced outages or what's your experience to, you know, bigger clean energy goals?
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. So first on the stakeholder side, I think if you step back from, you know, the statewide view or my utility view in Lansing or in Michigan, and you look across the country, you're going to see some common themes. And so you're going to see trade associations, industry groups, environmental justice groups, consumer advocates. And so I think to me, it's less about who's most powerful and influential as far as the name of an organization, because I think that also varies. But I think that depending on the issue as well. And I think it's more about what are the characteristics of a successful organization. And so, you know, one that has strategic vision, right? That has a goal that they're working towards. And then the way that they apply their voice in the process is really important, how they build trust, how they build credibility. And then at some point, you know, when it comes time for a policymaker or, you know, a leader to say, hey, we've got to come to an agreement somewhere here. I think where successful organizations really come through is do they know where to hold the line and say, nope, this is a core value, this is a core belief that we have. And then, you know, where to, you know, be constructive and compromise, and where to help people meet, right? There's some facilitation there too. And so I think those, to me, when I see successful organizations, it's that. I mean, I think there is a role for people who, you know, say no to everything and don't want to budge and don't want to move, and they can help shift the conversation. But at some point, someone's going to want to compromise and see some success. And so how are you preparing for that moment? So that's one. And then as far as the near-term goals and how they match and balance with the long-term work, if I find that if you get caught in the fire drills and the day-to-day, it is exhausting. It can be just really hard. But for me, what I find is when I tie that near-term work to that longer-term strategic vision and I understand how they connect, then that work becomes a lot easier, right? So what I mean by that is if I'm looking, I gave the example of, you know, some of the work that we're doing for the net zero in, you know, 2050 versus some of the day-to-day work on the distribution system and what the policies are looking like there. If you have that long-term vision of what the customer experience is going to be, what the environmental goals are going to be, then it starts to tie together, right? Because you can't achieve that future vision without a seamless customer experience along the way. And so that's how I make it work for me. Because otherwise, you know, it getting caught in the day-to-day, you lose the strategic vision and you start to lose your direction. So I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Abigail, Laura, anything you wanted to add?
Abigail, do you want to go and then I'll jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that for us, that question is fairly straightforward. You know, only certain entities have the ability to file before Public Utilities Commissions. Usually, it's just the utilities themselves and maybe a few state agencies. You know, without a doubt, utilities are the most powerful because they have the most resources and the most capacity to develop proposals, to analyze the data that's necessary, and to make filings before a commission. But there are a lot of other stakeholders who appear before a commission or are involved in other less formal ways, and those include environmental advocates, low-income advocates, business advocates. And it's the job of the commission to recognize that those stakeholders do have far less power than the utility and far fewer resources, and to enable their ideas to be developed through processes of what we call discovery or, you know, fact finding. And so that's part of our role. Is there is a place for non-utility entities to develop ideas in the regulatory process, even in the formal regulatory process. It is the role of the commission to help draw that out.
Yeah, so for us, I mean, because we are a trade association, you know, my most important stakeholders are my members, right? So I need to be paying attention, but then when we look externally, one of the things about advanced energy economy is that we're a multi-technology organization. So there are places, I think this speaks to what Christina was talking about, there are times when as a multi-technology organization, we're going to have more sway because we represent a broader, we take a systems approach and we're looking at the whole system and how all of these technologies can play together, even in how they can play together with incumbent current technologies. So, you know, there's that there are times when our voice can be a strong voice in these conversations. There are times when a more specific, you know, it is a specific issue around solar, or it is a specific issue around a certain technology where maybe that association is going to have more voice, or those companies are going to have more voice. So I think it is an ever-changing, you know, it ebbs and flows. There are different points in time when different voices speak louder, and I think Christina touched upon that. I think, you know, one of the examples that I would use right now in terms of, you know, where we are and how we are addressing this is we try to ask ourselves, you know, in terms of the near term, short term, long term, you know, we sometimes ask the question, 10 years from now, what is the policy that we're going to wish we had been working on now, right? So that because there are some near term foundational pieces that have to be put in place so that 10 years from now, the right policy is being implemented. So I think that's what we try to do. We have that sort of systems vision. We want to look at how all of these pieces are going to come together to create a new energy infrastructure. And then we need to look at, okay, so if we want to get there, what are the pieces that need to be in place now so that that can happen? So it's constantly going back and forth. And then you have something like what's going on right now, where with COVID-19, we have had to shift our short-term priorities and to start to focus in on some areas where specific technologies, you know, the energy efficiency community is really coming to mind for me right now, where there are some real challenges to fundamentally the way they are able to do their work right now, because they can't go into homes and do energy retrofits. So what pieces can we put in place to ensure that that critical part of our energy infrastructure is going to work their way through this challenging time, so that when we get out on the other side, there's still going to be these companies there to help do this very important work. So.
That's really helpful. And I feel like for all of us who work in policy, that balance between the short and near term is like so central to our work. And I think that framing of which policy do we wish, you know, what do we wish we would have been doing, you know, 10 years from now is a really helpful frame. Abigail and Christina, you both kind of hit on this when you were talking about stakeholder groups, but how do you guys think specifically about your all's responsibility to the communities you serve? And Laura, the same question for you, and maybe that's also something for like, how do you see your members thinking about your responsibility or their responsibility to the communities they serve in particular? And if you have any recent examples of how that's embodied in your policy work, that would be super helpful.
I'm happy to start. I don't know if this is sort of what you're looking for, but it's at the top of my mind. It's a recent decision, actually dissent that I made. So I see my responsibility, I see the community, your stakeholder, stakeholder communities as largely the utility and then ratepayers. Those are our primary stakeholders, and it might be a little simplistic to say that we balance the interests of those two stakeholders, but at the end of the day, my responsibility to those stakeholder groups is to ensure that rates that the utility sets are justified, and that they're both just and reasonable, and that justness is determined by are they evidence-based? Is there evidence to support the utility's request for a particular rate or funding? We have another similar guidance if legislature or legislation or statute gives us a different standard of review or additional standard of review. It's our job to make sure that the decisions that we make are consistent with that standard of review. So one recent dissent that I made was on it was a pretty small proposal to pay solar power that comes off of a carport at a higher rate than ground mount or other rooftop solar installations. And I rejected that proposal because I did not find that there was evidence to support any claim that the solar from the carport would provide benefits that were incremental and beyond the benefits provided by solar on the ground or on a different roof. And so in that case, I did not think that this proposal was just and reasonable because there was no justification to pay this for. So on the one hand, we had stakeholders who were supportive of the proposal. In fact, all of the stakeholders were supportive of the proposal. But on the other hand, it wasn't supported by evidence. So.
So for me, when I came to the utility, I came from a background which was almost exclusively public sector, public service focused. So I questioned myself, what is this going to be like, right? Like I have a high sense of personal responsibility and community focused, I guess for me, a community focused. And so I was really worried that how is it going to be for me waking up every day going to work if my ideals don't align? And I found that two important things happen with the utility is one, we can't pick and choose our customers can't pick and choose us, right? So right there is a really unique kind of relationship to the customer and a relationship to the communities and a unique presence. And then the second piece is there's no substitute for electricity, right? So if you don't like one grocery store, you can go to another. And it's not, as far as the utility goes, there's not really that trade-off. And so right there, that premise really shifts the way that you think about going into work every day. And so, and what I found was really kind of special in my line of work was that when we were working on statewide energy legislation, a lot of times, or any other policy that's coming up, what I found refreshing was, in the conversations with our CEOs, CEO who's now our chairman and our now new CEO, is a lot of times we would step back in the conversation and say, well, what's ultimately right for the state? What's right for the customer? Because if we're doing ultimately what's right for them, then as a utility and the way that we work, like it's going to be right for us. And so that there's a constant connection between the two in conversation around policy. Now, coming to that determination of what's right and what's best and what makes sense is backed by a lot of analysis and research and conversation and consensus building. But I feel like it's a really important place to start. And we can give some examples, but I think sometimes we make commitments too, like a net zero commitment, where we're saying, we know we can get to X% without doing anything esoteric, right? But we don't know about that last 20% or that last 15%, whatever it is. And so we're going to take a leap of faith and do a lot of work because this is something that we believe is right. And, we talk about it as, with climate change being one of the defining public policy issues of our generation, of our time. And so if we really believe that, and we believe that that's right for, our stakeholders and being our customers, number one, then I think that we need to act on it, and we do. And so I find that relationship right there is just carries a sense of responsibility to it that I appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting because we do come at this sort of sense of responsibility in a slightly different way. One, as you indicated in your question, Erin, you know, I represent companies, so I need to respond to what they're looking at. I think the companies that are members of our organization feel a huge responsibility to be equitable and I think fundamentally believe that if we succeed in shifting toward what we would call an advanced energy economy, that energy prices will go down, right? That things become more affordable. But I think there are some challenges in our sector that I look at in terms of our community responsibility. I think one of our challenges is that it's not a very diverse industry. We really do struggle to gain for hiring practices, and our companies struggle with this as well. And I think, you know, I could go on a long diatribe around, you know, we need to have better programs in community colleges. We need to have better resources even at the high school and elementary school level in communities that are underrepresented within our industry. So I think that's a place where we actually were supposed to have a conference at the end of May, and we're now figuring out how we're going to transition that into a webinar series. But one of the discussions was going to be on how do we more effectively diversify our industry? Because I think that's a different type of community responsibility, right? Is how are we making sure that, you know, this is fantastic. It's a panel of 4 women. That is not always an option. That's not always possible. And I think we really need to look at hiring practices, and then that has a ripple effect. We're not a workforce development organization, so I always have to, you know, walk that line very carefully. But I think these are issues that need to be raised, need to be surfaced, and we need to work with the broader community to help address them. So I think we look at the responsibility differently, and we try to look for the places where we can support our companies in working on these issues, and then ideally also to continue to educate the population and the representatives that we work with to try and put policies in place to help support this work. So.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really central issue, which is who is creating this policy and who is implementing this policy and who's having all of those touch points. And you know, that obviously has a very real impact on what these policies look like and how they impact the communities who, you know, are kind of central to the conversation we're having. On that point, I think, as well as things like, you know, Christina, you guys have made really ambitious clean energy commitments. Abigail, I'll say, it's interesting. I'm from West Virginia. I'm from Southern West Virginia. I worked on the Hill and worked with our PUC, our PSC, quite a bit. Talked to several other kind of similar state organizations, and you get a very broad diversity of views. So when you're talking about challenges around carport solar, or, you know, pushing or, you know, how to incorporate progressive climate policy, that's not necessarily something you hear across the board. So I'd be very curious to hear from you guys. What obstacles do you guys or your kind of organizations or institutions face in advocating or promoting new norms around energy policy? And you know, in whatever way you want to take that, whether that's kind of like who's at the table or kind of in your industry. And are there things that the wider energy community can do to kind of help break through some of those obstacles?
So I can jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there are some potential tripwires in this question, so I'm going to choose my words very carefully. First of all, so we're a bipartisan organization. So we seek to have all of these conversations in a way that will, you know, as I said, we are focused on the economic aspect of energy policy and where we think there is market opportunity. Candidly, we don't talk about climate a lot because that can be a really polarizing word and concept. So we tend to look at this from job creation, economic benefit to a state. How, like, we sort of are very careful in and around the way that we discuss this work, because we think it is very important. Abigail mentioned, evidence and facts. We work on, we use data to support the arguments that we are making, and we try to be rigorous in the way that we gather that data, the way that we gather that information, so that when we are presenting information, we can present it as a legitimate voice. Right now, there are some challenges to having that messaging and that languaging heard, but we have also had positive, constructive conversations with some folks that we would consider sort of unlikely allies. That's the phrase that we use. Simply by coming in and really bringing our member companies in to talk about the direct benefits of the work of their technologies, and to help people understand the opportunity that this can create for their state or for their region. But there are some challenges in having those conversations right now.
So, Abigail, sorry, go ahead.
So one of the, what I've been trying to convey through, for example, my role in our National Utility Regulators organization, and both from the PUC, is in helping people understand that the arguments that need to be made in front of utility regulators are different than the arguments that need to be made in front of, say, a state legislature. When you go to a legislature, and I'm sure, Laura, this is, your AEE and your clients, you can go to the legislature and, make arguments that describe the benefits, that tell a story, that include a narrative, that include, a lot of the societal benefit of the work that you're doing. At a utility regulator, we're bound to make evidentiary-based decisions, and so we need to see filings and documentation that is data-based and based in evidentiary-based. And that has been, I think, one of the hardest messages, both to communicate, and then I think that it's hard for people to pick that up. And I think that part of that is because a lot of, I don't know whether the data, for example, doesn't exist, or the technology isn't there to collect it, or the industry isn't there to analyze it and bring it forward. I think a lot about energy efficiency. And when utility regulation started demanding that energy efficiency programs be evidentiary based, in that, for example, shareholder incentives to utilities be paid out based on the quantitative net benefits that the utility could show. We have a giant industry of evaluation, measurement, and verification for energy efficiency. It's a huge industry that is incredibly rigorous, and that we need that same kind of infrastructure to support other clean energy data gathering and EM&V, so that can make its way into the utility regulatory process.
So, I'll give an example of working towards the 2016 energy law around the renewable portfolio standard. And I'm using this as an example to show how policies over time have done their job, and what that means for evolving certain policies, at least in Michigan. And so renewable portfolio standard as a mandate was set into place as a policy mechanism to drive investment into an industry that at a time had much higher prices than traditional forms of generation, or really develop an industry and improve economics and technology. And there was policy objectives, in mandating that utilities invest in something that was more expensive at the time. And over time, the hope was that the economics would become competitive enough where the mandates would no longer be necessary. And so what we found was that those RPS, renewable portfolio standard policies, were working, right? The technology costs were coming down, the technologies were improving, the supply chains were strengthening. And so that the policy worked so well that it was time to, we kind of came to a crossroads of, do you continue this kind of piecemeal technology mandate, or do you start to move to a more integrated view where you're balancing things like energy efficiency as a resource, or demand response, or other forms of technology? And what becomes important over time is it the technology specific resources, or is it the goal you're trying to get to? And there's many ways for utility planning and integrated resource planning where you can see lots of ways to get to an outcome. And so, you know, we took the position that an integrated resource plan going into the future, now with renewables being a lot more competitive and the technology is continuing to improve, that we can look at it more holistically, and we don't have to worry so much about, are renewables going to be part of our future? That's not a part of that's not a question anymore. It's how, right? And at what pace and what scale, and what are the economics and the efficiencies looking like? And so I think that's been a very exciting shift in the policy. I think getting people to say, yes, the RPS worked and it's time to move on is difficult. And I think the way that you can get there is through consistent communication. And I think there has to be some level of commitment and trust between the groups, right? So it's kind of hard for people to take, let's say, you know, corporation at its word to say, hey, trust me, I got it, right? That has to be backed by a lot of work and commitment. Because I think that over time, people, you know, when they have seen a mandate work so well, that becomes, well, how do we know? How are we going to be assured that you're going to do this? And I think that that's where you think about the policy, is putting in checks and balances in the process, so that the regulators and others can see in what are your assumptions being made? Why are you going this way? And so I think in the policy going forward, if you're thinking, oh, did I freeze? If you're thinking a little bit more dynamically about the policy.
That's super helpful.
Froze. Okay.
Yeah, you just very quickly,
Okay.
just like 1 second. No, I think that's really helpful. And I feel like that level of detail is really helpful to understand. So really appreciate it. We're getting quite a few questions from the audience. So I'm going to switch over to a couple of those in our last several minutes. So our most popular question, as regulators or utilities, do you think that enough is being done to enable our states to meet ambitious 10, 20, 30-year goals that have been set? And if you alone could pass one policy, what would it be?
I'll first there. You know, Rhode Island has purchased a lot of renewables recently. I think a couple things would allow us to make even greater investments or power purchase agreements in renewable energy. Part of that would be not focusing on the in-state economic development and focusing more on looking for the lowest cost clean energy resources. But if I could have one policy that I think could help us advance, and it would be a consumption-based carbon tax. Just thinking about the speaker that came before us, and he mentioned beneficial electrification, electrifying the transportation and heating sectors. From my spot as a utility regulator, I really see the need for consumption-based carbon tax in order to most cost effectively electrify those two sectors, which are outside the electric utility. And when we try to electrify on the backs of electric ratepayers, I think we'll get ourselves into a bit of a negative cycle.
So, you know, I think if our goal at the end of the day is to address climate change in a meaningful way, I think we're going to have to think more broadly than just the utility and the power sector, right? And I think the good news is that the conversation seems like it's moving there. And so I think I'm freezing again. And so I think that, you know, at some point we're going to have to get to a national policy where, you know, there is consistency, whether that looks like a cap and trade or some kind of way to look at the economy across the board and think more dynamically about an economy-wide solution that brings down carbon emissions. I think that's going to be really important. I think the utility-driven actions or regulatory actions at the state level or state level actions themselves to the legislatures, those are all really important because I think that they show movement. But at some point, state by state and company by company, if we're really serious about this, there's going to have to be some kind of national policy that supports that longer term vision. I think the good news is that we're seeing signs that the ambition is growing to see some kind of national policy. I think we're seeing the conversation evolve from technology specific carve-outs to a little bit more of a holistic view of, you know, what technology needs do we need overall? Like, how are we going to move as an economy towards this? How are we thinking about, you know, to the earlier speaker's comments, how are we thinking about buildings and, you know, end users, and how are we thinking about transportation? And so I think that those are all really important questions. And you're starting to see states and utilities and other entities, MIT is one of them, looking at pathway modeling and thinking about more holistically, not just a generation source, but what does this mean for all these other parts of the economy, the other parts of the grid. And so I think that's a positive thing. I'm hoping in the next several years that we can see something and that conversation continues to evolve.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with everything that Abigail and Christina have said. I just would say that issue of the fact that this is all happening piecemeal, kind of state by state, region by region. I mean, we do have some regional policies, but not many. You know, it's more like RGGI, where states have opted in to participate. For the companies that we work with, that lack of certainty, that lack of consistency between states, anytime they go into a new state, it's a whole new market, it's a whole new landscape that they have to learn. They have to figure out how they are going to adapt their business model to respond to the policies that are in place in that state. If they could have consistent policy across all 50 states, or, you know, it shifts the landscape dramatically. There's just a huge learning curve, and it means that, you know, certain states are really non-viable markets where they could be if there were policies put in place to allow for that to happen. So I would just agree with both everything that they've said, and also say that from the perspective of the companies that we represent, I know if they could have consistency and know what these policies are going to look like for multiple years and across regions at the very least, if not the entire country, it would have a huge impact on their ability to do business.
Great. Easy when everybody kind of agrees with each other. So one of the other questions we've gotten is, to what degree do you guys see infrastructure and community resilience to climate impacts as part of the policy structure and decisions? Do you see methods of putting value on it? And do you think, I think the question for a lot of us right now, do you think COVID-19 is going to change the discourse?
So I can start. I think I have a quick answer to this. A few years ago, the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission, working with stakeholders, adopted a cost-benefit framework that includes all of the benefits that the commission will consider when it's reviewing reviewing a proposal. And among those benefits, resiliency and sort of climate adaptation benefits and the benefits of climate, to mitigate climate change are included in that benefit cost framework. And what we mean by that is if a proponent of a program or a filing can either quantitatively quantify that benefit or analyze it qualitatively, that sort of becomes part of the business case for a proposal. And what since we've adopted that framework, we are now encouraging our proponents to focus on the methodologies for quantifying or qualitatively analyzing benefits such as resiliency and climate change adaptation. So in short, we will consider it if it's put before us. The focus, like I mentioned before with, the EM&V industry, the focus really now needs to be on how do we quantify this.
So for us, I'll give a recent example and something that we're still working through as a state. Last year during the polar vortex, the Midwest region experienced pretty significant events. And so on the electric side, there were resources that were unavailable across the MISO region. And so states and resources were being called on to export, right? We called on our customers for demand response, and for the first time at that scale in 20 years. And so I think we're seeing for sure the effects of climate change and what that's going to mean for customers. And on the gas side, for natural gas for home heating, I mean, if you remember the temperatures at that time, they were below freezing. In a state like Michigan that's really cold, that's even scarier than even I could explain. And so we had an event too where there was a fire in Michigan at one of the compressor stations where the gas send out to customers became challenged. And so after that event, thankfully we made it through. The state was okay. It was scary for a time, but we made it. And the governor after that stepped back and said, we need to review, she asked the commission to go back and do a whole review of the state's energy systems across all different resources and customers and regions. And out of that came a report of dozens of recommendations and things that the commission said, hey, these things worked well during the polar vortex, but we really need to still update and keep these rules and regulations and things fresh so that if we do get to another situation, we feel more confident walking into it. And so the commission's been on this now over a year-long process of engaging stakeholders. They've had a very open process to bring stakeholders and communities and different representatives in to talk about different parts of energy regulations and see how we're going to be more resilient going into the future with much more variable weather and really scary events. And so COVID-19 is another way to think through, these are emergencies. Now it's not a weather emergency the way a polar vortex is, but your response, you have to keep that power flowing for customers so that they don't feel like you're not there. That would be really bad, right? So our customer experience has to continue to be seamless, and the regulators play a role in that. Other stakeholder voices play a big role in that. So I feel good that the conversation's moving in Michigan.
Yeah, I think I have two sort of parallel thoughts on this one. One is that I think there has actually, this is something that we as an organization have been trying to address, that there has been, unfortunately, a perception that somehow integrating renewables is going to decrease resiliency, when we are actually seeing evidence to the contrary. In fact, during the polar vortex in the state of Texas, it was wind power that kept the electricity flowing during that challenging time. So I think, so from my perspective, I think these systems, if they are integrated appropriately, can actually strengthen and improve our resilience and have a really positive, constructive impact. I think one of the things, and this came up in the earlier slide deck from the video presentation, I think that right now we are going to be able to gather a lot of data around the impacts, right, of the fact that there are fewer flights, there are fewer cars being driven. I was reading an article in the Atlantic this morning that was talking about the fact that seismic activity is shifting simply due to the lack of movement around the world right now. It's having an impact on oceans, it's having an impact on the earth. So I think from my perspective, I'm hoping that what this will do, this opportunity to gather all of this data right now, is going to then allow us to start to better demonstrate the positive impact of reducing these emissions. That's my personal hope, is that we actually come out of this very challenging time. I think it is going to change things. It's going to change the way we interact with each other, I think, for a fairly significant period of time. And I think if we're smart, we'll be gathering the data about what the impact of that change in behavior has. And then ideally, a lot of smart people, smarter than I, are going to be able to translate that into, okay, so then how do we impact the policies so that we can take the positive, constructive lessons out of this and apply them so that we can build toward a cleaner energy future.
Laura, you mentioned the previous presentation, and one of the questions we got was that during that presentation, they had indicated that policy was perhaps the biggest variable in meeting goals. And they asked the question, do you think policymakers are feeling that kind of imperative and sense of urgency?
Go ahead, Christina.
Yes, I think that I agree that the policy piece is going to be really important. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think the other part, and I said this earlier too, is that I think the ambition is moving in the right direction. I don't think we're there yet, but I think there's good momentum.
Yeah, I mean, I work for the organization I work for because I believe that policy is going to make the biggest transformation. So I would just say yes, a huge yes. And I do think that policymakers are feeling that. I think that part of the challenge is that it is complicated and complex. And so it is incumbent on organizations like ours to help understand how these pieces can come together and to work with policymakers, because Christina used this phrase earlier, there is always the unintended consequence. We want the unintended consequence to be a positive one, but it really does take a lot of people coming together and really understanding the implications of what a given policy is going to do, so that when it is implemented, we make our best guess, we put the most into it, we implement the policy, and then it's an iterative process, right? Then there's probably, Christina mentioned this also earlier, probably going to have to circle back and make some refinements, because there will be that unintended consequence. So, and I think policymakers are aware of that as well. So they often want to make the right decision. Just making sure that all the different pieces come together is a really challenging thing to do.
Great. We're running up against time, but I wanted to ask, we had somebody drop in a question super early on that I wanted to get to. I think, in terms of, Laura talked about some of the impacts we're seeing with COVID-19. I think as people who work in policy, we know that these ideas of climate or COVID-19 or things like that, we can kind of talk about them in this really abstract academic way, but we know that the real impacts are not felt equally, that a lot of times, when we've talked about stakeholders and communities in this conversation, that the policy that we're talking about, again, isn't neutral. It's important who's involved in that. And so one of the audience members had asked, how do you guys center the voices of the most marginalized in your energy policy work? Or do you find that incremental policy action perpetuates structural energy injustice and environmental racism? And are there success stories about that you can share?
I'll I'll go ahead with this. So, as I mentioned early in the panel, one of the things I have been thinking a lot about is how when we use the utility bill to advance climate and clean energy policy, our most vulnerable and low-income energy consumers end up the most burdened by the cost of climate change. But there are things that we can do as regulators to try to address that if we're enabled to do so. One example is in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., low-income customers do not pay for the energy efficiency program charge on their utility bill, but they are able to take full advantage of their energy efficiency programs. So we basically need to allow low-income customers to receive disproportionate benefits because they're disproportionately paying more. And that's one sort of very tangible example of how you can design a program to make our most vulnerable customers whole first. Another thing that I'm thinking about, Rhode Island recently approved an offshore wind, 400 megawatts of offshore wind procurement that, is projected to be below market someday. We haven't set a rate design for that yet, but it would be really interesting if the legislature enabled us to allow those below market benefits to flow to our low-income customers before other customers. So maybe they see an actual bill credit first, and maybe they're held harmless from the above market cost of that project in early years. But in order for utility regulators to set sort of discriminatory rates, we need to be enabled by our legislatures in order to move away from typical cost causation principles. So a legislature could enable utility regulators to say, you can hold low-income customers harmless for this, or you can have rate designs that sort of disproportionately benefit your most vulnerable customers. I'd like to see more of that.
I could just speak really quickly if we have time. So I would say that the number of stakeholders that are bringing their voices to the table is growing, and I think that that's a positive thing, right? So, as a utility, I described this earlier responsibility that we have to customers and communities, and I think with that responsibility comes, the imperative to listen, and to not just listen, but to take that feedback and do something with it, right? And so I think that in, let's say, the integrated resource planning process, we had several public open houses before the filing and throughout the development process. We had technical conferences, so people who work in the industry that are maybe more inside the Beltway could give some feedback too. And with that, there are groups that represent, marginalized communities and different customer groups. And so I think, and our commission is really opening up this My Power Grid, right, that is focused on being stakeholder centric and engaging stakeholders. They do it online too, so if you can't make it in person to Lansing, that you can still participate. And so I think the conversation is starting to be more inclusive. I think, to Abigail's point, I think we have to really think about impact, right? So when we talk about, let's say, rate design or, COVID-19 and what that means for customers, that marginalized community group, however you define it, needs to be part of that conversation. We need to understand the impacts there because those who are struggling to pay their bills are going to continue to do so. And so if we start making changes, without looking at that group, then your policies become regressive. And that's a tough space to be in. And so I think that conversation needs to continue and be more inclusive, but I think we're making some headway there.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that one of the things that we all need to be considering and looking at is that it's understanding where some of these more marginalized communities lie. So we had a meeting in DC back in early January or February, and we were talking with a commissioner from a more rural state. And so I think there are issues also around access. And so, you know, some of these technologies are being brought to urban markets because there's a bigger market, so it's a better opportunity for those companies to build and grow, and then ideally they'll have a ripple effect. The challenge is, you know, how do you address bringing some of these opportunities to more disparate or rural marketplaces where there's not necessarily, you know, how do you have a smart meter when you don't necessarily have internet service that's going all the way out to some of these communities? So I think we really need to look again at the whole system and where are the disparities and how are we not serving those communities, and what can we put in place so that we make sure that we are providing equal access to the benefit and also to the capability. So there's a lot of work still to be done in that area.
Absolutely. Well, I know we've gone a couple minutes over. We had a break, so they gave us a little bit of wiggle room. So really appreciate this discussion. Thank you guys so much. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Nina.
Great. All right. Thank you all so much. That was a really interesting panel. And I was happy to sort of step through these more practical thought processes that you're having within the grand scale. So thank you very much for that. I think at this point for the conference, we have a 10-minute break until our